Okay, let's dive in. We've got some really interesting material here today, stuff that kind of asks us to pause and maybe think a bit differently about a topic. We're doing a deep dive today focused on Qurbani, the Islamic ritual sacrifice during Eid al-Adha. And more specifically, we're looking at the criticisms it often gets, particularly as our source highlights, criticisms coming from what it terms Western Orientalist perspectives. The main thing we're exploring is this one article. And it's pretty direct, doesn't really hold back. It takes those criticisms head on, basically saying, hold on, there's a much bigger picture here, one that it feels many critics just completely miss. So our mission really is to understand this source's viewpoint, to unpack its arguments, look at the context it presents, which it argues gets overlooked or maybe even ignored. It's about trying to get beyond the headlines, beyond quick judgments. So yeah, settle in. Let's dig into the source together.
And just to kind of set the scene for you, the listener, this source jumps right in by tackling that really strong claim you sometimes hear that Qurbani is, well, barbaric or cruel. It puts that accusation right out there from the start. And the whole point of the article, really, is to offer a totally different lens. One, it argues, is deeply rooted in faith, in quite strict ethical rules, actually, and also in social justice. The source basically contends that these core parts, the faith, the ethics, the social good, are exactly what critics often misunderstand or just leave out of the conversation.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack that first big point from the source. It starts right at the core, saying critics fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of Qurbani. They see the action, maybe, but miss the why. So according to this source, what is Qurbani actually about, beyond, the physical act?
Yeah, and what's really striking is how the source immediately shifts focus away from just the physical act towards the spiritual and the historical meaning. It frames Qurbani first and foremost as an act of sacrifice, of submission, and it ties it directly, explicitly to the story of Prophet Abraham, that huge test of faith. His willingness, because God asked to sacrifice his own son, which of course was then replaced by an animal. So the article presents Qurbani as this living commemoration, a yearly reminder and embodiment of that moment of obedience, of devotion. It's framed not as just some old tradition or a violent act, but something driven by love for God, by obedience, by remembering this key religious event. The source really stresses that the focus, from its perspective, is on the intention, the heart behind it. It's worship, primarily, submission. It argues if you only see the surface action without that whole spiritual backstory, you've already missed the point.
Okay, yeah, that definitely reframes it, shifts the focus inward to meaning and history.
Yeah.
But well, the criticism inevitably comes back to the practical side, doesn't it? The actual act of slaughter. Concerns about animal suffering are, central to how it's often portrayed. So how does the source deal with the ethics around the slaughter itself?
Right, and this is where the source gets really specific. It's a key part of its counter-argument. It tackles animal treatment directly. It claims Islamic tradition has these incredibly detailed, explicit ethical guidelines specifically for Qurbani. And it makes a very strong point, saying these rules are ancient, over 1,000 years old, it claims, established centuries before modern animal welfare laws started showing up in the West.
Centuries before, okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't just say that generally. It lists specific rules. The animal has to be healthy, treated well beforehand, no abuse. During the ritual, it needs water. Shouldn't see the knife beforehand. Critically, it shouldn't be slaughtered in front of other animals to minimize distress, you see. And the method itself is specified a very swift single cut, designed for the quickest end, minimizing pain. Plus, there's the mention of God's name. The source interprets that as acknowledging life's sanctity, that taking it is only okay under God's permission and these specific rules. The argument is these aren't just suggestions, they're integral, ancient parts of the ritual, designed with the animal's welfare in mind within that specific context.
That level of detail, especially about when these guidelines originated centuries ago, that feels pretty central to the source's argument here.
Yeah.
And this leads directly into a really sharp contrast the article makes, right? It puts these specific old ethical rules up against modern farming practices, particularly in the West.
Exactly. And it doesn't mince words here. It flat out uses the term hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy, wow.
Yeah. It draws this stark contrast between, say, conditions in many factory farms. It talks about animals in tiny cages, maybe drugged up just to survive those conditions, painful mutilations being common, and then being slaughtered by machines, often on a massive impersonal scale, driven mostly by profit.
Right, the industrial scale.
And it contrasts that with Qurbani, which, as the source presents it, is done with deep spiritual intention, often by individuals or small groups, following those specific humane guidelines we talked about. The source basically argues, look at the scale of potential suffering, look at the motivation profit versus worship or duty in industrial farming compared to Qurbani's rules.
Yeah.
And suddenly, the criticism aimed only at Qurbani starts to look like it might have a cultural bias.
So it's suggesting the concern isn't maybe purely objective animal welfare across the board, but something more targeted.
That's the implication, yeah. That it might be a critique based more on cultural or religious difference than a consistent application of welfare standards globally.
Okay, this is where, for me, the source really broadens things out and yeah, it gets really interesting. It moves beyond the moment of sacrifice itself. It talks about what happens after. And it brings in this whole dimension of social justice, of required generosity that, like you said, you don't often hear about in the critiques. What does the source emphasize about distributing the meat?
Well, if you connect this back to the bigger ethical picture the source is painting, this distribution part, it reveals a really critical social and economic layer. It's absolutely central, according to this article. Islamic rules for Qurbani are apparently very clear on this. The meat isn't just for the family doing the sacrifice. There's a set way it has to be shared.
Okay, a required sharing.
Exactly. 1/3, the source says, is for the family itself. Another third is meant specifically for sharing with relatives, neighbors, friends, strengthening community bonds.
Uh-huh.
And then this is crucial. The final 1/3, a full third, must be given to the poor and needy.
A whole third. Wow.
Yeah. The source stresses this isn't like optional charity. It's a required part of Qurbani itself. It says this results in millions of people getting nutritious meat globally every year, especially in poor communities where meat is, well, a rarity. The article points out for many poor families, this Qurbani meat might be the only meat they eat all year long.
The only time all year.
That's the claim. So the source argues really forcefully that this sharing demonstrates profound compassion, not just towards the animal, which is treated according to specific rules, but equally, maybe even more so in terms of human impact towards fellow humans suffering poverty and hunger. It's presented as like mandated social welfare baked right into the religious practice.
So putting it all together then, the source presents Qurbani not as just one thing, but as layered. It's got deep spiritual history, specific ethical rules for the act, and then this major required social justice component at the end. Given all that complexity it lays out, the source then suggests that the common criticism, the one focused just on animal cruelty, might not actually be the real issue for some critics. What does the source say is the real issue, especially for the voices it labels Orientalist?
Yeah, on this point, the source is very direct and maybe provocative for some. It argues that for quite a few critics, especially those coming from perspectives it calls Orientalists or certain Western viewpoints, the main concern isn't really the animals in Qurbani.
Okay, so what is it then, according to the source?
The article suggests the true, maybe unstated issue is a deep discomfort, maybe even an antagonism, towards public displays of religious faith, specifically Islamic faith. It suggests that sometimes the language of progress or modernity or even animal rights can be used as a sort of cover, a way to critique practices rooted in concepts like, well, submission to God or sacredness or divine authority, things that maybe don't sit well with certain secular views.
So the source is basically saying the criticism isn't always about the animals, it's actually about Islam itself.
That's the core of its argument on this point, yes, that in many cases it's less a genuine, consistent defense of animal welfare worldwide and more a targeted critique of Islam and how it's practiced publicly. It's arguing the stated concern animal welfare can sometimes be a proxy for a deeper cultural or ideological clash, a discomfort with religious practice that looks different from Western secular norms.
Wow. Okay. So let's try to sum up the source's perspective we've just explored here. We've done this deep dive into an article that really pushes back hard against that common narrative of Qurbani being just, cruel or barbaric. This source paints a picture of it as profoundly complex, rooted, it says, in deep spiritual history tied to Ibrahim, guided by specific ethical rules for animal treatment that it claims were, frankly, humane and ahead of their time centuries old, and fundamentally tied to massive social justice through that required sharing of meat with the poor.
Absolutely. The source's core message seems to be that Qurbani should be understood as a symbol of love for God, connection to history, duty to creation, and to fellow humans. It really tries to shift the frame away from just violence or bloodshed towards seeing it as an act of the heart, devotion, community responsibility, and it directly challenges critics. It asks them to look beyond what it sees as bias or just surface judgments and to try and understand the practice from within its own framework, its history, its spirituality, its ethics, its social impact. The source basically asserts that the practice's meaning and value are for the believers who follow its rules, not really for outsiders to judge based on potentially incomplete understanding.
Yeah, this deep dive into just this one source, it definitely gives you, the listener, a really substantial alternative viewpoint to think about, to weigh against maybe the more common story you hear about Qurbani. It certainly pushes you to think more critically about where criticisms of cultural or religious practices actually come from, especially practices that might seem unfamiliar. Are those critiques purely about the act itself, objectively? Or, as this source suggests, could there be other things going on, underlying motives, cultural misunderstandings, maybe even biases at play?
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, building directly on what this source claims. If, as this article argues, critics often miss or ignore the spiritual purpose, the specific historical ethics for the animal, and that huge social justice part, the meat distribution, well, what does that suggest about how we approach understanding any tradition, cultural or religious, that's really different from our own?
Oh, yeah.
What might the source's perspective on Qurbani teach us about, the importance of really looking past the surface, asking deeper questions about meaning and intention, and maybe, most importantly, about challenging our own potential biases and assumptions when we encounter traditions we don't immediately get?
Lots to think about there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking questions.